One of the most notorious and ruthless execution methods used throughout history was the guillotine, developed in France. The guillotine as a method of execution actually was around in a rudimentary form for centuries as different beheading devices were developed. But none were used on the sheer scale that the guillotine was, and it's believed that in France that the French king Louis XVI even suggested the use of the slanted blade rather than the crescent blade which was proposed, but of course the French king and his wife would later lose their heads on the device. The executions of these two were incredibly public, and thousands of people jeered and chanted as the blade fell, and the executioner held up their heads to the assembled crowd. But the execution method was used in public for centuries in France, and the last public guillotining actually occurred just before the outbreak of the Second World War, as a German criminal and serial killer was brought out in front of a crowd and was strapped to the board under the guillotine blade. However, this execution did not go well. Despite the blade falling well, the conduct of the onlookers that day was shocking, and it brought an end to the execution method being used in public. But what happened with the last public guillotining which was so horrific? Eugen Weidmann was from Germany, and throughout his life he committed many different crimes. He was to begin with a thief and someone who served 5 years imprisonment for being responsible for robberies, but whilst he was in prison he was acquainted with a number of other career criminals. These two men, after their release, moved into a rented villa with Weidmann, and they began to plot further crimes. They tried to kidnap someone and then ransom him for money, but this didn't go well. However, in the July of 1937, things took a darker turn as the group tried to abduct a 22-year-old dancer from New York named Jean de Cohen. She was at the time visiting a family member, and she wrote in a letter that, "I have just met a charming German of keen intelligence who calls himself Siegfried. Perhaps I'm going to another Wagnerian role, who knows? I'm going to visit him tomorrow at his villa in a beautiful place near a famous mansion that Napoleon gave to Josephine." The man she met was no other than Eugen Weidmann, and he would attack her and then strangle her. He murdered the young American dancer and then buried her body in the garden of the rented villa. Despite her family's searches, they could not locate her. Months later, Weidmann struck again as he hired a chauffeur, and this man was from Weidmann to the French Riviera, and then the car stopped within the shelter of a forest. Weidmann then took out a pistol and fired into the chauffeur's neck, and then stole the car and robbed this man of all of his money. He continued to attack and kill as he slaughtered a nurse who he had lured into a cave within a forest, and then he robbed her, this time shooting again in the neck. He now had 3 victims, and he then plotted to meet a producer of a theatre company and stole 5,000 francs off of this man before he then shot him. He also murdered a fellow prisoner he had met behind bars, as Weidmann shot this man in the neck as well. He carried out his final murder shortly afterwards, as he then went on to murder an estate agent. The French police knew they had a serial killer on their hands, and Eugen was tracked down and was ambushed by 2 officers who were waiting for him at his villa. He shot 3 times at the police, and he injured the officers, but they managed to wrestle him to the ground and subdue him by knocking him out with a strike from a hammer. He stated when interrogated that he regretted killing the young 22-year-old American girl and said, "She was gentle and unsuspecting. When I reached for her throat, she went down like a doll." Eugen Weidmann was brought to a trial, and he was then condemned to death for his murderous crimes. But his execution became written in the history books, as he was the final man who was executed on the guillotine in public. It was because of the conduct of the crowd that this sort of execution came to an end. The authorities that carried out the execution did not take into account that this was being performed in front of a changing society who had cameras ready to capture the final moments of Eugen Weidmann's life, and that many were poised and ready to take images of his execution. The executioner had been summoned from Paris to carry out this execution in front of the Saint-Pierre prison in Versailles on the 17th of June 1939, and he was led out of the prison by a number of guards. Weidmann was captured in images going to his execution on the guillotine, kicking and screaming, and one member of the crowd claimed that there was a powerful wave of howling and shrieking coming from the condemned as he approached the guillotine device. In France, the executioners worked before sunrise to detract crowds attending, but still, hundreds were turned out to see his death, and many of the cafes even remained closed in the morning for the execution. Weidmann was led to the guillotine wearing a white shirt, and the neck and collar of this garment had been either cut off or folded down. The reason for this was so that the blade fell, and there would be no chance of the blade getting caught in the garment and stopping a clean cut. This had happened many times throughout history, and many of the condemned even had their hair cut short to prevent this interfering with the blade. Marie Antoinette, for example, the French queen, had much of her hair removed before her execution. Because of this fear. With King Louis XVI's execution, it was claimed that none of his hair was removed, and this could have even caused problems with the blade falling. Despite the French population begin with not liking the guillotine as they viewed it too clinical, they wanted, as time went on, for executions to be carried out in a dignified manner and way. They did not like botches. Despite Eugen Weidmann's execution not containing botches, it certainly was an execution that was not conducted in the best way. So as he was brought outside of the prison to the guillotine, which had been put in front of the prison doors, many guards kept an eye on what was happening. The executioners wanted to put him out of his misery quickly, as he was screaming and kicking, and they did their work swiftly. Weidmann was strapped to a wooden board, and then this was tilted and slid under the blade of the guillotine, through the wooden scaffold and structure, and he was then locked into place. This must have been an agonising wait, as he took his last few breaths before the blade was released. He tried to fight his executioners on his way to the guillotine, and the crowd held their breath as the executioner made a final check, and then he pushed the lever. With this, the blade was released, and it crashed down at speed onto the neck of Eugen Weidmann, and his head was taken off in one swift, successful blow. Some spectators rushed forwards to see his headless body, and the blood of Weidmann scattered across the pavement, and it was said that the crowd did not hesitate to soak their handkerchiefs and scarves in the blood of the executed as a souvenir, but what the authorities did not consider was the fact that many photographs were taken of the deadly serial killer's final moments, and this was considered poor form and behaviour by the crowd. Many people had captured the moment that the blade fell upon Weidmann's neck, and following this, the pavement was cleared down and washed before the cafes opened again to serve lunch, as if nothing had happened at all. The execution of Eugen Weidmann was a notorious one, as it was the final execution to be carried out in public using the guillotine. It was then performed behind closed doors within execution chambers, inside the walls of prisons or in courtyards, so the crowds could not see what was happening. It was the beginning of a change for an execution device that surprisingly was used inside of France up until the 1970s. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe. Thank you.